Hi everyone, welcome to Sunshine Centers. Today I'm going to be taking you on a little walkthrough on how I make a tote bag. So I'm going to first walk you through my fabrics and how I'm going to make my pattern. So the fabrics I've chosen today is going to be a base with this tweed fabric. So the majority of the bag, you're going to see this fabric. But to line it, I have this scrap fabric from an older project. It's kind of like a lilac silk, and it's gonna line the entire bag. I have a complementary fabric that's gonna be on the bottom of the bag. It's a more scrap fabric from an older project. It's a little pink corduroy. And yep, so that's gonna be the secondary fabric. And to make our straps, I have this kind of beige, it looks like it might be animal print almost, fabric that I also have from an older project. So I'm kind of utilizing some scraps here to make something new and cool. So I'm gonna make this pattern as simple as I possibly can. All I'm gonna do is take a piece of cardstock. You can use whatever size of cardstock you have available. And all I'm gonna do is measure a line at 3.5 inches and cut it straight off. The bigger piece is gonna be with the tweed fabric, the main fabric, and the smaller piece you're left with is gonna be the complementary fabric. So once again, I'm just measuring 3.5 inches, then I'm gonna be drawing a straight line and cutting it out. Okay, so I've drawn the line on my piece of cardstock at 3.5 inches. So what I'm gonna do now is just cut that out. And to cut that out, I'm gonna use my rotary cutter just to get a straighter line than I would with a pair of scissors. All right, so I'm gonna use my rotary cutter just to cut along the straight line as evenly as I can. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is cut out each of our pieces we need with the pattern pieces we just made. And I'm gonna be doing that by tracing them out with this little blue tailor chalk right here. So I've got my base fabric lined up here. I already cut out a piece of fabric that's gonna be appropriate size for cutting, so I'm not too wasteful. And I'm gonna use my tailor chalk to trace around a little piece of cardstock. Okay, so I've traced my piece of fabric. You can see it here, it's like a faintly thin blue line. And I made sure to double up on the fabric because we're gonna cut out two pieces, the back and the front. So to make sure they cut out evenly, I'm gonna pin the two pieces together. And I'm gonna just do that by using my little pins and placing them kind of at the corners for the most part. So I made sure to pin in all the appropriate corners and one in the middle between each corners. And to cut out the tweed, I'm actually just going to use a pair of regular fabric scissors just because it is a thicker fabric and it would be harder to cut with the rotary cutter. Okay, so I was able to cut out the two pieces for the base of the bag, and I'm just gonna do the exact same thing I did with these pieces on the complementary fabric with the smaller pattern piece. So I'm gonna do that now. So we've cut out our main pieces now. So I have the base with the tweed as well as the complementary fabric. And where the complementary fabric is going to go is we're just going to sew it to the bottom of each piece like that. It'll look a lot neater once we get it sewed. So what we're going to do now is we are going to cut out the main piece as well as the complementary piece with this silk fabric. We're going to do it the exact same way we did with the main pieces, just with the lining instead. So we've cut out the majority of our pieces now. I have my main pieces here and my lining here. I haven't forgot about the straps yet. I'm gonna cut that once I sew the majority of the bag out because I'm not sure what size I want the straps to be yet. The last thing we have to make is just a little heart embellishment. So I'm gonna show you how I make that. So I cut out this tiny little half of a heart shape from another piece of cardstock. And what I'm gonna do is take my secondary fabric and I'm gonna place that little heart piece on the fold. So when I cut it out, we'll have a full heart. So I've cut out my little heart shape and our next step is just to get to sewing. So I'm on my second day of working on our little sewing project. So our next step is we are going to sew on the lining to each of the corresponding main pieces. So to do that, I'm first just gonna pin everything in place. I also wanna add that off camera, I cut out the 2 strap pieces. I just did this by cutting out about 1.5 inches wide and about 22 inches upwards. And yeah, so that's gonna be the strap pieces, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so I've pinned together all my lining pieces to my main pieces. And what we're gonna do now is I'm just gonna use my sewing machine to do a straight stitch along every side of each piece. It doesn't have to be perfect or anything because we're gonna be covering up all the seams with binding tape at the end of this project. So here's my first lined piece, just to give you an example. As you could see, you could very clearly see the stitching, but we're not going to worry about that because at the end of the project, it's all going to be covered up by our bias tape. I do see a little bit of excess up here, so I'll trim that off so everything's all even. And I'm just going to do the same thing 3 more times to the rest of the pieces. Okay, so I finished up the hems at the top of the bag, and what I've done now is I've pinned on the straps and the heart applique, and what we're just going to do is do a straight stitch along the straps and a zigzag stitch around the heart. Okay, so I've stitched on both the straps on both sides, as well as the little heart in the middle of the front. So we're almost done here, but what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna take my complementary piece or my bottom piece of the bag and facing the correct side towards correct side, I'm just gonna sew it on the bottom of the bag. And I'm gonna do the same thing on this one as well. So what I'm gonna do first is just pin it in place. Okay, so I've pinned the bottom piece to both sides of the bag, and what I'm going to do is sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each bag. Okay, so I sewed the bottom portion to each side of the bag, but as you can see on the inside, it's quite messy here. So what I'm gonna do is use some bias tape to clean up that seam. So basically this tape is just gonna cover this entire seam so it looks a lot cleaner and neater. I'm gonna leave about 1/2 centimeter empty here because that part is gonna get sewed when we connect the two bags. Okay, so I've cleaned up the seams by covering it with bias tape. And now my almost last step is I'm just gonna sew these two pieces together by pinning them together right side together. And then the last step would be to bias tape those seams, but I think I'm just gonna skip that and just show you the final product. Okay, so I've sewed the two bottom pieces together. And what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna pull this up. And now the bag is basically inside out. And I'm just gonna sew each side 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then the bag is basically done. So here is my final little product. It's my little bag. It's very tiny. It could probably only fit a small book. But here it is in its completed form. It's made out of a lot of crazy stuff, and I think it came out pretty decent at the end, so